Okay, hello everybody. My name is Martha Alter Hines with Living the One Light, and I'm here today with Cara Silversmith, who I'm so happy to be talking with. Cara and I met a couple of years ago when I was a guest on her podcast, um, which is I highly recommend, by the way, which is called What of the Ground We Are Standing On. And I'm going to put a link to the episode that we did together, so you can enjoy that because it was, as I'm about to explain, that conversation 2 years ago now was one of the favorite conversations I think I have literally ever had in my life. so, so I reached out to Cara because for a lot of different reasons that we're going to get into here, but yeah, Cara is a storyteller, is an educator with regard to environmental science and ecology, and just an amazing human being. And so what and is based in is Scottish and is based in Scotland. And so what we're going to be talking about today, I think, is going to be weaving together what it means to be beings of earth and beings of spirit, and how storytelling can be a bridge to help us come back into right relationship and right balance with ourselves as land and earth and ocean and spirit and all of it. There's so much that we could talk about today, but perhaps this will be one of many conversations that we have over time. So thank you so much, Cara, for being here. And I am honored.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come along. Yeah, the episode that we did with yourself, myself, and Catriona Blank, who's a German storyteller, we co-host our podcast, What of the Ground We Are Standing On. And when she said, "Oh, I've got this amazing person to come and talk to us," and you came in and you told us this story, and yeah, people can listen to the episode. But I just loved the synergy of it, and that's one thing I like about storytelling is it connects us. Everything we do to a certain extent as humans is storytelling. We make meaning and we make stories about how the world around us works, how our connections to each other, our relationships, and to the land itself. And I think that for me, as you said, yeah, my background is in environmental science and education. But for me, storytelling is definitely the way that I think we need to go for the future to reconnect with spirit, land, soul.
Yay. Yeah. And I would love to just before we get into kind of more of the stories I think that are alive for you today, I would love to give people a nugget of what happened in that conversation we had 2 years ago because it's still I'm in awe. Like inside myself, still my jaw is sort of dropped by what happened in that conversation. So just to fill everybody in, basically we were on the I was on the podcast to be discussing a completely different topic. I was actually um just about to be starting a free symposium that I held 2 years ago, that Katrina was a speaker in, and I was basically there to be promoting this free summit. And then we started talking about my own background as someone, my ancestry coming from Scotland. Relatively recently, my great-grandfather, immigrated from Scotland, and I have a very, very, very powerful relationship with the land there, especially the Oban area and the Western Isles, which is where my family's from. So I started talking about this uh, mm, journey that I took by myself to the Isle of Lismore, where I'm getting like emotional, um, where my family is from. And I went there by myself in I want to say June of 2016, 2017. And I was called to go there by the spirit of the lake. The Lady of the Lake is what she called herself. And anyway, she guided my whole journey there. And then I had among many, many, many other experiences, the main thing she wanted me to do was to be there on the night of, she wanted me to be on the island on midnight on summer solstice. And so I was, and that night she guided me to go to walk to this particular part of the island, the northwestern part of the island, which is very isolated, and where there's an inlet of ocean, but very shallow ocean. So anyway, long story short, I walked up there and it was still relatively light because it's, Scotland, and it was summer solstice. So um I was there at
It
midnight.
doesn't get dark.
No, no. So basically, long story short, I had this whole experience that I told you on this podcast where I was initiated in a sense by a group of spirits that came to me out of the ocean, and they they did this magical thing on the palms of my hands, and they had all this colors going through my body, and then they draped me with like seaweed and shells, and this whole thing. And then in front of me, out of the water, rose this city of the ocean, and it was like this multi-layered, almost like a mountain, but with layers of, it was a city. I don't know how to describe it other than that. Anyway, and then we went from me telling you this experience I had had to you saying, well,
I,
actually,
yeah, yeah, there's a story about that.
yeah.
So
um
yeah, very, very well known story in Scotland, the seal hunter story. And then I told you the story, and yeah, I think it
you want to
was
give sort
really
of the
resonant.
Yeah, do you want to give the mini version, and people can go and listen to that podcast for the
The
full?
mini version, yeah. So the seal hunter story is in Scotland. In Scotland, we still have people who believe that they are descended from spirit folk, the fairy world, and particularly in the Western Isles. There are people who claim descent from the selkies. Now, selkies are spirit creatures who live in the sea and they appear looking like seals, but they can take off their seal skin and dance on the beach and so on. And there are many, many, many stories about selkies. But this particular one, when you said that, I was like, well, it's the seal hunter.
And
And
I went,
once there
what?
was a man, you went, what? I don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, there was a man who used to hunt seals because throughout human history, people have hunted. We are creatures of the environment. Everything is interconnected in one way or another. But there was this guy who was hunting seals, and he enjoyed hunting the big seals particularly, even though he suspected they might be selkies. And one day he'd taken his dagger and he had gone for this enormous seal, massive thing, and he'd stabbed the seal. And the seal turned and slipped back into the water before he could finish the job. And then later that night, somebody had appeared and banged on his door and insisted that he had to come and hunt some seals for him. And took him to a cliff and draped him in a cloak and pushed him off the cliff. And they ended up falling under the water. And they ended up going to this city, a city that was built up on layers. And they
Oh, what?
swam into this.
I'm sorry, I'm just in awe again. because Okay, keep going, keep
It's
going.
okay. um, Built up on layers, and the man who had taken him and draped him in this had turned into a selkie, and he was able to breathe underwater as well, and took him to this throne room effectively because the spirit, the selkie that he had stabbed, was the king of the selkies, and it needed his healing power to remove the dagger and put his hand over the wound to heal it so that the Selkie would be returned to health. So that's kind of the short version of it, I guess. But the Selkies repaid him in gold as so long as he swore never to hunt seals again.
Wow, wow, wow. Yeah, there's so many things I could say. I'll
Oh,
just
but
say,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I'll just say one thing, which is that um, a big aspect of what what the beings like those ocean beings and then other earth beings who come to me in where I live now and other places I've been in the world, a big part of what they show me is, or they try to help me remember and help others remember, is their medicine, like their way of healing, like exactly what you're describing. Um, that's a whole conversation. Like, anyway, thank you. Um, yeah. So
You're
just
welcome. And yeah, I thought that was just such an interesting when you said it. And I've said before, when somebody says something, stories often just suggest themselves. And that's not a story that I tell regularly. And I think up until that point, I don't think I'd ever actually told it as a story. So yeah,
wow.
it really
I've definitely never heard
connected.
that story. Yeah. And this idea of the city coming out of the being in these layers. I mean, I never would have rationally thought of such a thing. And then it's anyway,
Mm-hmm.
I was in awe, in total awe. Wow. Amazing. Um, so yes, again, I think we could go in infinite directions with all of this, but um
Absolutely.
yeah, one thing that I've been feeling into a lot personally, and I would love to, maybe this could be an entryway into where we go with this conversation next, is I mentioned you before we started recording the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which it turns out is one of both of our favorite books ever.
Yeah.
Because
I
it's
just
a,
recommended it to somebody else yesterday. Definitely.
yeah,
Everybody should
exactly.
read that.
Literally, I feel like every single person should read that book. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, and so part you can jump in with whatever that it brings up for you. But one of the things it brings up for me is how crucial it is that we come back into, if you want to call it more of an indigenous way of being with the land, more of ourself as a being of earth, just like all other beings of earth are, and that they are our family, our friends, they are persons, we are all here together. There's no separation between us. And yeah, and so my body happens to come from Scotland. Your body happens to come from Scotland. So that's where, in a sense, I gravitate toward when I think of that personally, but it's true for us in all of the entire globe and all of Gaia. So for you, when you're coming into how you feel called to support the world in this time through storytelling, etc., and our relationship with the land, what's alive there? Where do you feel called to go with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think braiding sweetgrass is a good place to start because, again, Robin Wall she came from a scientific background, Western science, and all the rest of it, and her family had been removed. I mean, she is an Indigenous member of well, the Americas, and has tribal ancestry and so on. But there had been that separation because of colonization and the removal of people. I mean, she talks about the Trail of Tears and her grandfather being sent to boarding school and all the rest of it. And I think that is something that has happened over centuries, millennia throughout the world. There have been various stages that have removed us from the land because at one time we were in synchronicity with the landscape, with the land. We are creatures, we are animals, we bleed, we take all our nutrients, and everything that we have comes from nature, and it still does, no matter how separated we are. We can claim that we can just go to the supermarket and buy everything, but actually it still all comes from somewhere and still all goes somewhere. We are still part of the interconnected system, but there have been separations that have then taken us away from that. And for me, storytelling is one way that we can get back into that relationship because we are creatures of narrative. We tell stories and we make meaning by telling stories. And a lot of the meaning I think that we've made in Western society, particularly, have been narratives about working hard, getting a good education, the way that society is run, and so on. And we've had this separation of human from nature, this sort of dichotomy that some people say started with Descartes and the Enlightenment, but actually probably goes back way beyond that. I mean, I could start having a rant about the Romans and that whole sort of colonization thing as well, but maybe not get into that one just yet. But I think storytelling for me as an environmental educator, it's the stories that we tell. And I think with so many of the issues that are going on in the world, we are telling facts, but we're not telling the heart, we're not telling the soul of the stories. And that is a huge problem because we don't connect to facts. Facts are just, they're there, but it depends who you ask what the facts actually are, right? It's our hearts and our soul, our spirit that then connects on a much deeper level. And that's where stories for me come in, because stories speak to what's alive in us, whatever story it is. I mean, I could tell a story to an audience of 50 people, and every single one of them will take away a different story because every one of them is a different person and resonates with a different part of that story. And that is the magic, I think, of storytelling. But each of the stories also bring alive our feelings. They connect to our emotions. We have an expression in Scottish storytelling circles about stories connecting us eye to eye, mind to mind, and heart to heart. And it's true, they do. They connect us on so many different levels. And for me, storytelling is how we make sense of the world. And we always have done. I mean, you look at the Aboriginal tribes in Australia, who were cut off from most of the rest of human society for millions of years potentially, but certainly thousands and thousands of years. And there is stories about everything. There's the dream time, there's the maps, there's the art, there's the painting of the land, there's the dancing, and so on. And these are all ways that we make meaning and make stories. And I think human society, wherever we are and wherever we came from, we did this. And we still do it to a certain extent, but perhaps we don't do it as consciously now as we used to. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And for me, again, getting back to Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about her journey to rediscovering sort of how to become Indigenous. And one of my favourite chapters in that book is talking about the fact that actually we are all Indigenous to place, or we all have the potential to be Indigenous to place, by recognising the plants and the animals and the interactions in the ecology around us. And I think that for me is something I just want to be able to bring alive for people. And I think storytelling is a way to do that.
Amazing. So, what story is the most alive for you right this minute? I have
Oh
a guess.
gosh. Ah. That is a very good question. I think possibly the Wheatler story.
Oh,
So I live on the outskirts of Aberdeen, and there was a Scottish traveller who told fantastic stories and was a folklorist, and many of his stories were collected, and the University of Aberdeen has the Elphinston Institute, which has a bank of so many stories and folklore and so on. And I think the traveller people were ones who held on to some of the stories and the connections for longer than many settled people, I guess. There have been travellers in Scotland, well, ever since the end of the last ice age. And I think they are the ones that, because it was all in oral tradition, none of these stories were ever written down. They were living, breathing things, and I think that made them really important. And the Wheatler story is an interesting one because For me, I mean, I like telling stories from the ancient past. So the likes of the Cailleach story, the blue goddess who created Scotland in the first place, or some of the tales about why we have dreams or why we have music, or some of the creatures like the selkies and so on. And this was a much more recent one. It's only a couple of hundred years old, but I think it speaks to that want, that need for connection in whatever way. So yeah, can I share the story?
Please, please, please.
Long ago, although maybe not that long ago, there was a Wheatler. A Wheatler was a young man who would make whistles, flutes, out of the branches of trees. He'd get especially the suckers of the birch or the rowan tree, and he would peel the bark off them so that they were smooth and sleek, and then he would burn a hole through the middle of them and drill out holes for the fingers, and then he would blow and see what tunes came out. And then he would cure them by putting them into salt water for 2 weeks until they had hardened and would not split. And when they were dry, they were ready to be polished and played. And he plied his trade, going from village to village, town to town, playing these musical instruments and selling them. He would teach people the old songs, the ones that told of the eagle flying high over the cliffs, the ones that told of the rowan tree growing high up the glen, of the berries falling and the sun doing its dance around the world, of the stars and the animals and the plants. He would tell all these in stories and ballads, and he would sell his musical instruments. One day he'd wandered far up into the hills, and there was an ancient woodland, one of those dark, deep places that had not been felled by the axes of those hungry to make houses over the years, one of those dark woods where there was still the mix of all the trees and the plants that had begun to seed just after the Ice Age. And there was a rowan tree, the most gorgeous rowan tree he'd ever seen, its canopy stretched out above his head, and the flowers were blooming. And there he saw some suckers at its base, and he cut them down and made himself a good medium-sized flute. He knew that this was going to be a good one. He'd sold many of his good flutes, and he wanted one special one for himself. And once he'd peeled it and cut out the holes, he'd left it to cure in his bag, and he went around the villages again, talking to people and learning a little bit more about this corner of the mountains that he'd never visited before. And then when the flute was ready, he sat down at the side of the road and he began to play. But the notes were in a scale that he'd never heard before. I mean, he was used to every single flute sounding slightly different, but this one, he couldn't quite get a handle on it. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't flat, it wasn't major or minor. He couldn't quite work out what it was. He knew that it would make a beautiful sound if only he could master the tune that it was made to play. And he tried, he practiced as he went, and he couldn't quite get it. And his road brought him back past that ancient woodland again, and he sat on a stone underneath that rowan tree, and he picked it up, and he spent ages, but eventually he got the notes just in the order that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and his skin prickled, and he was filled with warmth, as if the sun was high in the sky, even though by that point it was late in the evening. And as he played, the tune made him want to smile and dance. And he heard a rustling behind him in the woodland. And there, out of the trees, walked a woman, a tall, elegant woman with hazelnut skin and ash hair, grey to her shoulders. She had the most piercing green eyes he'd ever seen. He'd never seen a woman like this in his life. He was speechless. He just sat with the flute in his hands, and watched her as she approached him. She smiled and said, "You did it. You managed to make the tune, to call me from the spirit world, from my fairy realm, to be with you. And I want to experience your life and your time in the world. Teach me what you know. Teach me about how humans are in the world. And I will be your wife for 7 years, if you will have me. I can't give you any children because I am not of this world, but I can tell you how to play and make your music even more beautiful than it is already." And well, the young man, he didn't know what to say. How could he refuse this beautiful woman? He was worried what his family would say, bringing somebody who looked so different to anybody he'd known back. But she just smiled and said, "Take me home. They will accept me." And so he went home and introduced her to his family and said, "This is my wife." And everyone was happy and there was celebrations. And they spent the next 7 years travelling every road and every trail, every hill and dip and coastal path that there was. And they visited the whole of the country. And as they did, they brought music and they taught people how to play these tunes. And all too soon, the 7 years were over. And they ended up back at that ancient woodland, sitting on the rock underneath the rowan tree. And she took his hands in hers and looked at them and said, "I believe we have had a wonderful time, and you have shown me so much, and I hope you have also learnt from me." And the young man smiled and said, "I have learnt so much. I have learnt how the river flows. I have learnt how the birds sing. I have learnt how the swallows move from country to country, bringing with them the spring and the insects aloft. I have learnt how the roots dive deep into the ground and bring up the nutrients from the bones of the earth itself. I have learnt how the air moves around the world and takes our songs with it." And she smiled and said, I am glad we have both learnt from this experience, and now I must go." And the young man held her hand and said, "But won't you take me with you?" And she shook her head and said, "I can't, because you are not of my world and I cannot take you. But if you want, I will pull back the veil and you can see for a moment where I'm going." And so they turned and faced the trees, and the woman moved her hand and pulled back the thin veil between the worlds. And it was as if the man's eyelids had opened for the first time, and he saw all the colours and sounds and every connection that there was in this most glorious image before him. And all too soon it disappeared. She disappeared through the veil, and he was left standing once more in the beautiful glen next to the trees that didn't seem quite so bright anymore. And as she'd instructed him to do before she left, he broke the flute, because he knew that it couldn't be used again. Not to call her from the spirit world anyway. He would have to make a new one and learn to play it if he was ever to call her back. And so, taking another branch from that rowan tree, he peeled it and he burnt the hole through the middle and he drilled the holes. And all too eager, he began to try and play it before it was even cured, but the notes were just ordinary. They were the ones that anybody could play. But he cured it and he took another branch just in case. And he spent the next few years, then decades, trying to make a flute as beautiful as that one that could play the scale between scales that would make the hairs on your neck rise and your heart soar. But it didn't work. It was a once in a lifetime event, a once in a generation, maybe a once in a ever event. And he grew older and he grew tired. And he never married again or found anybody that he could connect with in the same way. And one day he'd been down on the coast and he'd been trying to busk, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The music wasn't the same without her by his side, ever since he'd seen that glimpse of what the world could be. He'd never quite settled. And he was taken into a poor house because he had no money left and he had no food, and he caught an infection in his chest so that he could barely breathe. And he was laid down by the fire. And the woman who ran the poor house shook her head and said to one of her assistants, "He won't last the night." And later that night, there was a knock on the door. And there, outside, was a woman with hazelnut skin and ash grey hair, with the most piercing green eyes you've ever seen. And she said, "I come to visit an old man that you have here." And the woman nodded and said, "Aye, he's through by the fire." And the woman went through to the fire. And a while later, the woman was confused because that woman hadn't come back again. And she went through, and there was nobody by the fire. The man had disappeared. And it said that perhaps his wife found a way to take him into the spirit world after all. And that's the story of the Wheatler.
Amazing. Thank you.
I love that story because it's so ordinary. It could happen to anybody, I feel. This opportunity to just find the right notes to play or the right words or the right way of seeing, a different way of seeing. And then suddenly you could see what the world could be or what the world beyond is. It's that connection, I think, to spirit, to soul, to understanding a different way of knowing where we are and who we are.
Yeah. On a sort of somewhat literal level, actually in the last 2 days, this morning and yesterday, um, I live I live in the coast of California, and I'm right by the ocean, so I can smell the ocean from my bedroom window. I'm back like it's a 15-minute walk for me to the beach.
Yeah.
Um, so very, very close, and I have a strong relationship. It's different, but a very strong relationship with ocean beings here. Um, on the west coast of Scotland, it's much more powerful and visceral in a sense. I think because I'm guessing because my body is from there, but I don't know. Anyway, but here it's also very strong. But I feel more like a visitor as opposed to that my body is obviously not from California. Anyway,
Mhm.
the last 2 days I had these ocean. What they were telling me is that they're mermaids, except they were in human form. Like they didn't have the fins; they had legs, and they were women, and they came and basically they led me. I was lying in my bed doing my praying, but they basically said, "Come with us," and they took me to the beach near here. It's an isolated, very quiet beach, and they said, "Just lie here on the beach and let us show you." It was very similar feeling. Like it wasn't that they pulled the veil; it's just that there was no veil. so, so then they just
Yeah.
said, um, "Just let us show you what this way of being in love is, right? Like love with the ocean itself and the dolphins and the whale and the seaweed and the just let it just be here and let us." It's like switching dimensions in a sense. I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of uncanny, like what you're
Yeah.
describing there. And then, like, I didn't marry them, but um,
No, but I love that expression about being in love because a few people have been asking me recently with some of the biodiversity loss that we've gone through in the world in the last, particularly the last 50 years, but also some of the local stuff that's happened in terms of mining, war zones, all the rest of it. And people say, what can we do? And there are many things that we can do, but the most important thing is to love and to try and find that way to love the world regardless of what else is going on. And if you love a place, I think I don't know if I mentioned it when I spoke to you before, but a couple of years ago, 3, 4 years ago, I went up to Blackwater Pond, up near Provincetown, and Mary Oliver was one of my favourite poets, and she wrote so many poets about Blackwater, about the forest there, and so on. And we pulled into this parking lot, and I thought, it's not going to be a special experience because I think for me, wilderness experiences have such power because they're so far away from civilization and all the rest of it. But as soon as I stepped onto that boardwalk, you could just feel the love that that forest had poured into it, that that lake had poured into it. And I just felt this so strongly that this is a place that has been loved and loved well. And I think that is one of the key things that we can do, actually, wherever we are, our local walk round our city, even. Is there a plant or a tree or something? Just pour love into it and it will reciprocate. You will get that back. And those environments, what they really need, yes, they need all the ecological processes, they need their keystone species, they need not to be drained or whatever, but what they really, really need is love. And I think that is so important. And the fact that that's what you were invited to do was to love the ocean and to understand that deep love for the ocean. I think, yeah, that's what we need.
And it was like being in a field of love. It's the love of the land and the ocean coming to me too, right? It was again, like you're saying, a reciprocal
Yeah,
kind of all-encompassing experience. Yeah. Yeah. Not transactional, but
absolutely.
like just
No,
is. Yeah.
yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's not a transactional process, and love isn't. If you love somebody, something, the world, a tree, a plant, whatever it happens to be, if you love it, then you love it.
Yeah.
And if it loves you back, great. If it doesn't, then you still love it.
Mhm.
Love doesn't change. Love isn't one of those things that oh well, if you do this, this, and this, then maybe I'll love you. That's not how it works.
Mhm. And
So
I
yeah,
was actually yeah, I was mentioning this to uh, some of my clients this week. In can't remember which context, but anyway, I was talking about realizing, thinking about how, in a sense, we've actually been trained out of loving. So I'm thinking, I used to be a
yeah,
psychotherapist, right? I used to be a therapist specializing in trauma work and that kind of thing. And as a psychotherapist, I was taught not to love my clients, which is ridiculous. You
yeah,
know, it's like, I mean, and I get it. Of course, we don't want to cross boundaries. You don't want to treat them like, don't want to cross roles, all of that. But literally, what is going to help a person to heal other than the quality of love, right? That, of course, I'm going to be feeling love for a 6-year-old who has been highly traumatized. There's no other way that child will feel safe with me if I'm not feeling love somehow. It's
yeah,
like terrible.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
that's the thing. As people, we feel what people are feeling towards us. We get an innate sense of actually what is alive for people, how they are feeling about us, and so on. And if their words don't match what that feeling that you're getting, then that causes disconnect. And it's the same with the plants and the creatures around us, the spirit of the land, and so on. If we're saying one thing but doing another or feeling another way, then that doesn't work. So we have to make sure that our actions and our feelings marry up, which is the goal. But at least if we start with being true to how we feel, I mean, we know that time in nature is one of the best things that we can do for our health. I mean, the earth is here. The earth loves all its inhabitants. And if we spend time there, we will get a healing boost from that. And I think, yeah, for us, it's acknowledging that and being able to reciprocate and go, actually, I love being in the woodlands. I love being at the edge of the ocean. I love walking along these cliff edges and picking up rocks or whatever it happens to be. And it's noticing those moments. It's noticing that that tree-lined street in the city that you live, that's the place where you go because it's cool and it gives off shade, and actually it makes you feel brighter rather than the parking lot round the corner that's just concrete. There is definitely things in there that lift us, that make our world special. The more green spaces we have and the more time we have to connect to the world, the more love we feel and the healthier we are, and the healthier
Yeah.
the world will ultimately be.
Yes, and then a big, big, big topic that, it's like its own thing. Go on and on and on about this, but I would say even just in our relationship to science and the scientific method, again, we've been trained out of
Yeah.
love. So we've been trained to be
Yes.
objective observers, which, as we know, in our understanding now of quantum physics, is literally impossible. Like literally,
Yeah.
the minute you observe anything, you are a participant. So we
Yeah.
know that's actually
Absolutely.
incorrect. Yet academia, and I really highly respect academia. I love academia. I love our intellect is super important, all of that. And we've been very trained in academia, both of us, all of it, most of us. And we've been trained to be scientifically minded, devoid of
Yeah.
love on purpose. It's like
Yes.
consciously taught for us not to love the thing we are being in relationship to through science, which, I think we need to retrain ourselves what that means, and what that means to
Yeah.
be a scientist, or it's in a scientific relationship with life, right? That it's about relationship.
Yeah. It's coming. Absolutely. It's coming back to that holistic understanding of the world and our relationships within it. The scientific method was about breaking things down to their constituent parts, and the fact that it was designed to be like a machine. Machines work in a mechanical way, and therefore, can we break everything down into this mechanical process? So, how we work, how our eyes work, how our body digestive system works, all the rest of it. But it misses out the heart, the soul, the spirit, all the rest of it, which actually that's the bit that's important. And as you say, as soon as you observe something, it changes. You change as part of that. Yeah, I mean, stories. I tell a story to 50 people, 50 different stories come out, because that's the nature of relationship and storytelling, but actually meaning making as well, because we are all different, we all have a different experiences. Every interaction you have changes you in some way, and it's true for the world around us. Everything that we interact with is changed in some ways by that interaction, and it's getting back to understanding that and honoring that, celebrating it, I think, is really important, because the more we celebrate our connection with the bird that woke you up in the morning, or the snail that was sitting on your path, or whatever it happens to be, you are in relationship with these things, whether you're conscious of it or not. You do have a relationship with them, and being mindful about it and making it a loving relationship changes everything.
Literally everything. Yeah. Amazing. So uh I'll give you a choice right now. So there were a couple other topics that you mentioned before we started recording. And so I feel like we have a choice. We could either kind of just wrap this up here and say to be continued in maybe many other conversations, or if you wanted to bring in another component of what is alive for you, I would be happy for that as well. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the Indigenous ways of knowing because I think
yeah,
that's a really important
yeah.
one. I mean, you'd said yourself, sort of, you feel like your body is from Scotland. My sister did one of these DNA ancestry tests recently and discovered that we are 99.7% Scottish, which is as Scottish as you can get because, yeah, which is
Yeah.
ridiculous. And yeah, it ties back to another story, which maybe I would tell at some other point, but it's about the story of a princess. Don't know whether she was a Syrian princess or Persian or Cypriot, and she and her 22 sisters grew up a life of luxury and expecting to have everything, people obey their every order and all the rest of it. And then they got married off. And because of the changes in culture at the time, suddenly their husbands were expecting them to do what they told them. And they were like, no, this isn't going to happen. That's not how we were brought up. You have to listen to us. So there was this real tension. And Alpa, who was the oldest, she said, well, hang on a minute. These men are telling us what to do and beating us if we don't. This is not acceptable. So between her and her sisters, they plotted to kill their husbands and get rid of them. But the youngest sister was like, no, that's not how we do things. And actually, I quite like my husband, Tim. He's one of the good guys. So she went to their father and said that this was the plan. So the 22 sisters got put on a boat and cast adrift and out through the Pillars of Hercules and into the Atlantic Ocean. And their boat travelled for weeks until it hit land. And the land that it hit was one that was bare because it had just been the ice age and everything had been scoured clean. And the only things there were the spirits of the land. And the spirits of the land took on these women and they listened to them and they taught them. And in time, they had children. And these were the children of Alpa, or Scotland.
Oh my God. I'm kidding. Wow. Okay.
So yeah, it's interesting that the 0.3% or whatever of me that isn't Scottish is apparently Cypriot. And I think that was an interesting thing when I found that out, and I thought, "Ooh, that's interesting, that connection to the story." Um, But Scotland's had an interesting history, as everywhere has. There's been migrations of people over the years, people move, languages change. We had the Picts and Romans came, kind of, Vikings, all the rest of it. So there's been a mixing of people and the Celts from the West as well. And like you, Martha, my family was from the Western Isles. My grandmother grew up in North Uist. And she was a native Gaelic speaker. She didn't speak any English. Her family didn't speak any English. And it was only when she went to school that suddenly she was told she wasn't allowed to speak the Gaelic because it was the same sort of time that Robin Wall Kimmerer's grandfather was being sent to the boarding schools and they weren't allowed to talk their native languages or have their traditional practices and all the rest of it. So she wasn't allowed to talk her language, and it was a terrible time. I mean, she was beaten regularly for slipping into Gaelic, and the family ended up leaving their croft, the parcel of land at the western edge of Scotland on the wild Atlantic, and moving to the mainland and becoming part of the city of Glasgow, I guess, at that point. And I think it's interesting because so many of our place names in Scotland are still Gaelic place names. Many of them have been given English names as well. But the old Gaelic names, they will talk about place. They will talk about the place where the rowan trees grow. They will talk about the place where the fire was, but the birch trees sprung up again. They'll talk about the cliff of the eagle, and all these things. They'll talk about the seasons and how the sun shines on places at different times of year and so on. And I mean, where I am on the edge of Aberdeen, there are lots of stone circles that our ancestors put into the land to tell us stories or to channel energy and so on. I don't know exactly why they all were built where they were and so on. There's lots of stories about that as well. But it's this knowledge that our ancestors had about being in right relationship with the land and the landscape, or a different way of knowing and understanding the landscape. And there's a real movement in Scotland to try and get a lot of these place names back because they are descriptive. They are the place where the moss grows or whatever it happens to be. So they tell us about the land and the landscape. And I think that's really important because that's another way of loving the land. And it's getting back to that understanding of ecology. Again, the Ogam, the way of the ancient Celtic calendar, for example, where you had the 13 months of the year, and the first month of the year was Beith, or the birch tree, because the birch tree is the first tree to colonize a bare piece of ground. It's wind pollinated and wind carried, so you have a bare piece of ground, and the seeds from the birch tree land in the soil, and they need very poor soils. They don't need much to grow, and they'll grow and they'll grow, and then they'll fertilize the soil and allow other plants to come in. So the first month of the year is then the birch. And so it goes on through the year, and each of the months is associated with a tree. So you have all these different trees that then have characteristics and qualities, whether it is the nursery tree or the protector, something like the oak tree that then is the king of the forest and has this crown and supports so many insects. I mean, there's over 200 species that rely on an oak tree, for example, but that comes later in the year because you can't have the oaks without having the birches and so on. So it's having that understanding. And I think Indigenous knowledge like that is important because obviously the year starts with the spring and the new growth and the rebirth and that recycle and so on and goes round. And I think we mentioned before about rebirth and renewal, and the fact that maybe we are approaching a time of rebirth and renewal. There is so much possibility and so on in the world, and having those connections and re-establishing a lot of our knowledge, I think, is so important. And again, it comes back to love. If you love a place, then you'll notice these things. You'll notice what the first shoots out in the spring are. You'll notice when the birds start reappearing, the swallows, whatever it is, wherever you are. Landscapes are all different, but to know a place, to really know a place, it is walking the land at different times of years and paying attention and showing it love.
Mm, incredible. I just, yeah, I'm a little bit stunned. Yes. And for me also, it feels like a part of what is trying to rebirth itself is us remembering these ways of being, but and at the same time also the trees, the rocks themselves, the stones, the land
Yeah.
itself, the wind, all of this is alive and has literal ancient wisdom and is trying, that's my, in my experience at least,
Mhm.
trying to help us come back into our knowing of that ancient wisdom. I mean, again, we could go on and on and on and on,
Absolutely.
but in
Yeah.
that same trip to Lismore, one of the many experiences I had was going up on again, the lady of the lake was guiding me every day, right? So she told me to walk up to this outcropping. There's a Roman, it's like a, I don't know what to call it. It's almost like a tiny little fort up,
Torch,
up,
broth.
yeah, bro. Yeah,
It's maybe
that
a broth. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that. Right. So she told me to go up there and just sit, and it's extremely windy. I mean, it's because it's a tiny little island in the middle of this, water. And so anyway, so this huge amount of wind. Okay. So I'm up on the broch, and it's this 2,000-year-old thing that I'm sitting on. And the wind, I mean, I've never had this experience anywhere else in the world. The wind came, I just sort of lay back, closed my eyes, and the wind literally came. It was so powerful, so strong, and it took me into itself. And then it started showing me, basically showing me life through the eyes of wind, or through the being of wind, I guess is a better way to put it. And I mean, wow. The wisdom, the wisdom doesn't even begin to describe the feeling, is like,
Yeah.
uh, I don't have words. I don't
Yeah.
even have words.
No, yeah, it's incredible, and I would urge anybody who hasn't had the experience of yeah, just letting the wind hold you for a moment.
Yes.
There was a hill that I used to go up when I worked at one of the parks that I used to work in, and it was called Windy Hill because it was really windy up there all the time. But you could go and stand on this hill and just lean into the wind, and it felt like the wind was carrying you. And if you properly gave yourself to it, yeah, again, it felt like it was teaching you
Yeah.
some sort of ancient wisdom. And I
Yeah.
think that is a really important aspect that our ancestors, they noticed the wind, which direction it was coming from, what it was telling them, and it does. It brings all sorts of information and knowledge with it,
Yeah.
as
Literally.
every aspect of the landscape does.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we're so disconnected. We're taught that wind is just, I don't know, air moving or something. It's like, no, 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 no. It is
Yeah,
alive. It is literally, I'm telling you, it is literally alive. I mean, I don't need to tell you, but really,
yeah.
really, really, really,
No.
really. Yeah,
Yeah,
incredible.
absolutely. And I think that's the thing. There are scientific ways of knowing and understanding, and they are valid and they are one way of looking, but the world is such a rich and multifaceted and interconnected place that you can't just follow one thread and go, "Oh, well, I know it now." Well, no, you don't. How it's like saying that you met somebody at a cocktail party once and now you know them. It's like, well, you know who they were showing up as on that day. You don't necessarily know anything more about them. And it's that relationship. You can have a relationship with the wind or a river or a tree for your entire life and still not know it. Not how it is to be that particular element,
Yeah.
but we can come to a closer understanding, and that helps us to come to a closer understanding of ourselves as well, which I think is also coming back to that reciprocity. They've got things to teach us, and also we've got much to give.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I don't know why I feel compelled to say this, but I would also say I feel it feels really important to then also not generalize that I had this one experience with wind, therefore wind means this. No, no, no. That's right. It's so
No,
nuanced and
no.
there's infinite variety of all of it. And I'm even again just thinking of that a different time I had in okay. So I've been to the Isles a few times, but so I had that experience with the wind up on that rock that one time, but this very distinct from that also in the hills above Oban. Um, I don't know how to describe this exactly, but it was like another thing I experienced was spirit of the hills. This woman, this like I actually think she's a version of myself. To be totally honest, that's the feeling I had is that I have, each have my experience is that we each have infinite manifestations simultaneously existing in all different places and dimensions, whatever. But there's this element of spirit of the hills there that's very distinct from the spirit of the wind, even though I would say that spirit of the hills to me feels almost like a breeze. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like really subtly yet distinctly different. um and that would be a whole other topic. I would be curious if there are stories about spirits of the wind, I mean spirits of the hills, or of these things. um Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are so many stories, and that was the thing, sort of coming into the recording. I hadn't really got a plan as such because I thought, well, there are so many different stories or ways that you could take it. I mean, when you were talking earlier about Lismore, I was thinking about the story of where dreams come from, and that's very much a case of meeting the sort of spirits who live in the hills and put
What?
dreams out into the world and so on. So I know I'm landing that on you now. There's so many different stories though. There's where the music comes from again about finding the harp that came from the ocean, and that's how we have music in the world and so on. So there's so many stories. But I mean, the wind again. Thinking about even ancient Greek mythology, you've got Zephyr, the west wind, but there's winds. Each of the winds has its own name and its own identity and its own understanding of how it shows up in the world. And these are things that we have known for thousands of years, but we see them differently through the lens of society and Western civilization. And again, that lens of academia, science, and all the rest of it. So our perspective has shifted because we are different people than we were then. But we still tell these stories because actually they're true. And one of my favorite quotes, and I can't remember the storyteller that said it now, which I'm kicking myself for, but myth is truth that didn't necessarily happen, or something like that. So all these myths, they are all true. They are completely
Mhm.
true, but they might not have happened the way that we tell them, but they're still
Yes.
true.
Yes,
And I
exactly.
think that is really important, is actually there are so many ways of getting to the truth and understanding the world.
Mm.
And yeah, stories, again, for me, yeah, there are so many out there that tell us little bits about our connection and our understanding, and the fact that they have come down from thousands and thousands of years ago. I mean, the research has not really happened into how old some of our stories are, but we know some of these themes have been around for at least 4,500 years, probably 30,000 years or more. And you just think that was before we learnt to plough. That was before we started to domesticate animals. That was before we changed from the land and the landscape. And that's why, for me, oral storytelling is so important, because it is this thread, this web that takes us back to deep time when humans were in a different place and a different understanding and relationship with the world.
Mm.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, beyond, I'm really beyond words. It's just wow. Um, and I would love, love, love to have this conversation continue anytime, multiple times, when the timing is right. It's just an open
Yeah.
invitation. Yeah. Um, is
Picking
there
up some
any,
threads would be fantastic.
what'd you say?
I said just picking up any of these threads would be fantastic.
Exactly. They could go in so many directions. Yes. Um,
Yeah.
so before we close, is there any other last thing that feels alive that needs to be said or?
I think just going back to this fact that we are all indigenous to the world, even if we've forgotten it, we are all at some point of, I mean, I don't want to go into the intergenerational trauma and sort of the way that society puts us into boxes and all the rest of it, but we all are indigenous and we all have the capacity to go back and to reconnect. And maybe we have some sort of responsibility to try and do that for our own sakes and for future generations as well. So I think that's really important. I think, yeah. And if that's one thing that I can do in the world is to help to reconnect people. I mean, my environmental education business is One Nature Education because we are all one. And that's what I would love people to come back to seeing, is that the environment is us. We are the environment. And if people can get that understanding of that, that would be amazing.
Mm. Yes, when you're describing the some of these stories might go back 30,000 years. I literally feel it
Yeah.
in my bones. I literally feel my bones like vibrating, like
Yeah.
talking, as the stones, as the earth itself. It's like they're saying to me, Yes. Almost like this, like the stories would be like a tuning fork to my literal
Yeah,
bones, like my actual
yeah.
cellular memory of this reality, you know?
And I
So
think that's the thing. Some of our most ancient tales, they do. They really make us feel, oh, I know this story. I know this somewhere. It is that deep truth, that resonance that we have. And yeah, the more we can tell stories to each other and to the world, I think the better.
amazing. Okay, so I know people are going to be very intrigued and are going to want more. So where can people find you? And is there anything that,
Um,
yeah.
Um, carasilversmith.com is my website, but also onenatureeducation.com. You can find me there. I was going to say I'm currently on Facebook, but I don't think I've posted anything for such a long time. So website is probably the best place. You can reach me at cara@onenatureeducation.com if you wanted to email. If anybody wants to sign up for my newsletter, that would be fantastic. I was just saying to Martha before we started, I'm hoping to have a refresh of some of my offering within the next couple of months. And yeah, What If the Ground We Are Standing On, the podcast, have a listen to that. And if anything resonates with you, let me know. I'd love to know what sort of other topics that you'd like to hear about, because Catriona and I are going to hopefully start recording some more episodes shortly. So anything that resonates with people, because it's about the ground that we are standing on, that connection to it and that resonance that we have is so important. Yeah, so I guess that's the key things. I am writing a series of books at the moment looking at stories and sort of science and connection and so on. So you can keep an eye out for them. Not quite sure when they're all going to get published. I had one, When the Storm Breaks, that was fundraising for a flood that happened a couple of years ago, which then looked at witchcraft and how we demonize the environment effectively.
Yes.
So yeah, it's kind of connecting that. But if anybody wants to sign up for a newsletter or get in touch just with any comments or ideas, I'd love to hear what's alive for people at the moment.
Wonderful. Yes, and please, I really truly would love to continue this conversation anytime. Anytime.
Well, thank you,
So,
Martha. I really appreciate the opportunity to just share some of my thoughts and also hear about your experiences and connections as well.
mm, thank you. And yes, please, everybody, comment and share with us. I just know, I know so much is going to be percolating for so many people. Our bodies are going to be vibrating, off the chart here. Yeah, I can already predict that. So share with us. We would both love to hear and share with each other. And yeah, yay, more to come.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.